Buenas tardes. A nombre del Instituto de Estudios del Caribe, de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, recinto de Río Piedras, y a nombre del personal docente, no docente y los estudiantes del instituto, le ofrecemos una bienvenida a esta, nuestra más reciente conferencia caribeña dentro de la 33ª edición de las conferencias caribeñas del instituto. Mi nombre es Jorge Giovanetti, coordinador académico del Archivo de Ciencias Sociales y del Caribe, y estaré sirviendo como moderador en la conferencia de hoy. Queremos agradecer al equipo del instituto, del decanato de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales y de Radio Universidad que nos ayudan en nuestra presencia virtual. Le pediremos a los asistentes que pongan sus teléfonos celulares en modo de vibración para no afectar la conferencia ni la grabación. Tengan presente también que estamos transmitiendo. Hoy queremos excusar al comentarista asignado Michael Kusher, que no nos pudo acompañar por un imprevisto, pero sin embargo tenemos a nuestra conferenciante de hoy, la doctora Jessica Adams Stone. Voy a presentar a la doctora para entonces que ella proceda con la conferencia. La doctora Adams Stone tiene un bachillerato en inglés con honores de Bryn Mawr College y un doctorado en inglés de la Universidad de Tulane en New Orleans, con especialidad en literatura americana, teoría postcolonial y teoría del performance. Además, tiene formación en Derecho, graduándose con honores de Juris Doctor en el 2022. Adams Stone es catedrática asociada del Departamento de Inglés en la Facultad de Estudios Generales de la Universidad de Puerto Rico en Río Piedras y actualmente sirve como directora de la revista Caribbean Studies. Antes de llegar a la UPR, se desempeñó como profesora en la Universidad de las Islas Vírgenes y en la Universidad de California, Berkeley. Es autora del libro Wounds of Returning Race, Memory and Property in Post-Slavery Plantation, publicado por University of North Carolina Press en 2007, y es coeditora de varios libros que incluyen, con Cecilia Cillian y Elmid Melans, Revolutionary Freedoms, A History of Survival, Strength and Imagination in Haiti, publicado en el 2006, con Michael Bibler y Cecilia Cillian, Just Below South, Intercultural Performance in the Caribbean and the U.S. South, publicado por University of Virginia Press, y con Don Waliszek, editó el libro Guantanamo and the American Empire, The Humanities Respond, publicado por Palgrave en el 2017, y una secuela a ese libro en el número especial de la revista Sargazo, publicado en 2017 y 2018. Ha publicado otro sinnúmero de artículos académicos para públicos más amplios y también trabajos de ficción en diversos medios. Le damos la bienvenida a la doctora Adams.
Más rápido, ¿verdad? Gracias a todos por estar aquí, a todos. Y agradezco su atención. Voy a hablar en inglés, así que empiezo ahora. I was saying to Jorge that we should do like a performance art introduction of some kind, but that was kind of last minute and we couldn't figure out exactly how that would work. But just imagine that we are now, the lights are dimmed. We can't hear that sound of the air conditioning. Actually, the sound of the air conditioning is the sound of the waves gently breaking on the sand. And we're gonna take a deep breath and talk about some things that are really sad. Hopefully I'm not gonna cry a little bit. When I was looking over my work before, I printed it out, I was actually like finding myself kind of tearing up at some point. So I'm gonna try to keep my emotions under control. So here we are, sitting in the dark. Reflexiones sin luz. After Hurricane Maria, we lost power. I say we, but I mean we in a particular sense. We lost power here in the apartment. In Spanish, you would use a different metaphor, not a metaphor at all in a way. La luz. The light was gone. We lost light here, and at night into the middle of February, I used these little rechargeable solar things that everyone was getting on the internet. Information and supplies passed from one to another, spontaneous choreographies. I don't feel that I should claim that we lost anything and include myself in that we. We is political. We is unchosen. The power was not lost, but stolen. Not lost, but reclaimed. Not lost, but rather a struggle commenced for it on a new front. Thomas Jefferson dreamed of an empire of liberty. The nascent nation would spread the values of freedom, specifically through the means of empire. He was thinking about Native Americans. He was thinking possibly about Cuba, as he seems to have done not infrequently. His dream was the American dream. And in Puerto Rico, people are still living with the consequences of this contradictory vision of racism and humanistic values spilling over into each other and creating a blanket of thick tar. I recently read a book about how to survive disasters. It examines the advantages of denial and its disadvantages. It discusses paralysis. I had to stop reading to go to another faculty meeting where once again we were told that things were bad, but unknowably bad, and therefore we should all go back to work because there was nothing ultimately that could be done. It's the same meeting we've been having since I arrived. The same professors stand up and object passionately, but the problem is inchoate. We veil ourselves with denial and file out the paralysis that is the poison of the university, its secret weapon, spreading once again through most of our veins. Maybe I'm just speaking for myself here, but then again, maybe not. Is this better, Dawn? How about this? How about this? Yeah, better? Okay. By the way, thank you to Don Wallachek, who's here, for the information about the Empire of Liberty that that Jefferson wrote about, fantasized about. It's not that people don't want to do something. The problem seems to be that the only option may be to live life in the moment as best you can. The time of the event, in which there is no time, but instead an eternal present. In evacuations, things become revalued. You look around for what to bring. You improvise on the theme of your life. Things in that moment are not stable objects, but densely woven values, and unpredictable too. They take on new, unlooked-for meaning, revealing unsuspected depths. A photograph becomes more valuable than gold. A cheap piece of jewelry or a piece of paper becomes more important than anything else imaginable. What do disasters reveal? They reveal, for example, that time, like all other things, is not equal. Cane lines the road to Fajardo, thick stalks pressing against each other, against the road, the view of the islands from the sky. They look tender, their slim beaches and dead coral, the streams of sargasso in undulating lines. After a disaster, there is not absence, but another kind of presence. It is a presence that has turned in on itself, that has to devote great energy to simply surviving. As Dean McCannell has written, sociologist of tourism, nothing attracts memory more than a gap, a lapse, silence, or suppression. We walk around seeing everything the way it used to be and the way it is now at the same time. The river that runs behind the apartment, filled in with concrete, an egret still visits, its squawking dissonant against the casual chatter of chickens and songbirds. The green keeps coming back, even after there was nothing but bare branches. The trees are blooming orange and purple now. I have arrived too late for the riches known to those who are now dead or dying. But I have arrived in time to see the riches that will be lost to those who come from the future. Un caso de desahucio. We don't live stories, but fragments. Automatic gunfire explodes the morning just before dawn. The old man on the other side of the fence beats his dog on Sundays. A pregnant homeless woman asks for change at the stoplight. Later, a man slows his car, starting to mouth something through the rolled-up window. She knows what he wants. She waves him away. Wealthy Puerto Ricans pull into the parking lot at the riding stables in McLarens and Ferraris. An estimated 43.1% of the population lives in poverty. The primary language of the most expensive private colegios in San Juan is English. The history of colonialism and imperialism is instantiated in mundane details that compress time. Capitalism has never actually been able to distinguish between a person and an object. The notion of, quote, humanity itself has not been an absolute, but rather a judgment. As Kostas Douzinas writes, historically the idea has been used to classify people into the fully human, the lesser human, and the inhuman. Douzinas goes on to note that the meaning of humanity after the conquest of the New World was vigorously contested in one of the most important public debates in history, end quote. The origins of the concept are evident in certain paradoxes of the Enlightenment. For example, that the French government disregarded the way the revolutionary motto of liberty, equality, and brotherhood contradicted the fact of thousands of people enslaved in French colonies, and the similar congruent desire not to engage on the part of slaveholders like Thomas Jefferson and pretty much all the other founding fathers with the way in which slavery remained illegal in a new republic dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The idea of humanity as a feature detachable from the human body thus pre-existed slavery and enabled it. It is inevitable that a society in which the notion of rights has grown up curled around the legal insistence that some people do not belong to humanity will continue to reveal the effects of that history, and particularly where issues of property are concerned. As Cheryl I. Harris writes, slavery produced a peculiar mixed category of property and humanity, a hybrid with inherent instabilities that were reflected in its treatment and ratification by the law. The twisted reasoning required to justify the proposition that enslaved people were first and foremost property was part of the logic of greed. The system that mediates property, quote, rights is a system that responds to power above all things and can be deployed to attack the weak at any moment. Struggles over property suggest that the originary slippage in the logic embedded in the law of societies in which slavery was legal has remained powerful and determinative. In this context, the way that property rights are structured, associating these rights with masculinity, whiteness, and wealth, while promoting individuality, is part and parcel of a system that makes violence towards marginalized people an everyday occurrence. On February 6, 1980, Adolfina Villanueva Osorio was shot to death. In front of her children. This is real. I really feel it. It's just like, I feel like sometimes we have to like have the emotion, you know, even in an academic context. And her husband, while facing down the armed police officers and officers of the court who had come to evict the family from their home in Barrio Tocones, Loíza. The terror that befell Adolfina Villanueva and her family was a crime based upon a legal order. I believe they went there to kill, Adolfina's sister, Marta Villanueva, said later. The law and lawlessness intertwined to such an extent as to expose the underlying fact that sometimes all that separates social order from disorder is the name we give it. But perhaps in this case, it would be more accurate for me to argue that what we refer to as the law is deeply enmeshed with a social history out of which its precepts have grown. That a precondition of the law may be a form of forced tacit consent to the social precepts that underlie it. I know there's at least one other attorney. So my husband is maybe gonna like contradict me a little bit. He will. Which is cool. We welcome other interpretations of what the law means. Adolfina Villanueva's death became almost instantly emblematic of the government's systemic failure to ensure equitable housing for Puerto Ricans. It crystallized the way in which colonial/imperial inequalities in Puerto Rico intersected specifically with property rights. The history of property here was always fraught, beginning at the dawn of the Spanish colonial era with the Requerimiento, a 16th century Spanish legal document rattled off to people who had never before heard Spanish or spoken by sailors at sea, a kind of apostrophe to the island, right? Apostrophe in the poetic sense where you're speaking to an audience that is essentially not there. And this, from the point of view of Spain, justified their claim of dominion over the native population and natural resources of the island. Slavery quickly followed. Flash forward. In 1941, the Ley de Tierra made some progress toward addressing that disparity, but as it evolved, it recognized and rewarded those who were already long settled on tracts of land, while punishing the people who that government referred to as invasores, who had seized land to live on out of desperation. As Erika Fontanes Torres writes, following agrarian reform and then the adoption in Puerto Rico of the industrial model and the so-called Operación Manos a la Obra, the political philosophy and notions of property changed. The government moved toward a utilitarian focus, and concepts of social justice were not a priority. Despite the success of Operación Mano a la Obra in modernizing the country, the fact is that at the end of the 1960s and during all of the 1970s, we see the growth of a serious crisis in terms of access to housing, especially in urban areas. A crisis that signaled the grave situation facing disadvantaged groups, and importantly, women. This crisis led to one of the most important instances of social activism in Puerto Rico, the movement of Rescates de Tierra, of which there was a wave at the beginning of the 1980s, the moment in which the events that led to the death of Adolfina Villanueva in Loíza took place. That's the end of that long quote. Newspapers reported that the police officer accused of shooting her had been found not guilty. But the accounts I'd read of the case were inconsistent, and I wanted to read the case file to see what evidence had been presented, what the lawyers had argued, what the witnesses had testified. Let's just say it. What I wanted to know was the truth. And it sounds naive, maybe even bizarre. I'm aware that there's nothing absolute about the law. Like other collective rituals, it functions in a rigidly prescribed manner and is authorized by a larger, overarching system, which in this case is no less than society as a whole. Perhaps as a result, the law has a particular power to order fragments of life in the shape of story. Legal structures are a membrane through which the individual passes into the collective, and more specifically, through which individual stories become part of a collective story, the story of the values and struggles that mark a time and place. The law thus generates a unique form of storytelling, one that has the full weight of the state behind it. And that storytelling doubles back on itself, has consequences. That's what really happened. It enters the social and historical record for good or ill, no matter how objectively true is the narrative that emerges from the ritualistic back and forth of the lawyers, the structure of the courtroom, the documents filed, the witnesses sworn under oath to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. Whatever the outcome of this process, whether or not we would call it justice, something profound emerges that tells us what a given society is most profoundly invested in. It is, we could say, the truth of the collective. Adolfina's case remains in living memory and is a vital point of reference in the community where the events occurred. But the law professors I asked weren't sure the legal documents themselves still existed. Because the jury's verdict had not been appealed, which is not uncommon in criminal cases, there was no judge's decision in the legal databases, and I didn't have ready access to a case number I could take to El Archivo Central to request the files. I had found in the newspaper reports only the first name and first last name of the defendant, who had been arrested and charged with murder, which was the same as that of many other Puerto Rican men. I went to the court in Carolina and asked the women in the records room for help. They knew the case, and somehow they found the information I needed. "Don't lose this," one of them said, appearing from behind a heavy door, in her hand a piece of paper shaped like a butterfly with the case number on it. The file had been transferred to microfilm, and as I reviewed it with an official in the Central Archives later, we pondered the fact that we were probably some of the only people, maybe the only people, other than the attorneys and the judge in the case, to see the back and forth of the lawyers, the stories of the witnesses, the palpable sense on every page of how wrong everything had gone. On or about the 6th of February, 1980, illegally, voluntarily, and criminally, and with malice aforethought, killed the human being, Adolfina Villanueva Osorio, as armed with a rifle, he inflicted such grievous wounds that they caused her death. It was an election year. According to a motion filed by the defense attorney, the arrest of his client was named as one of the achievements of the administration in power at the time. Hi, you guys. The publicity was such that the defense attorney asked the judge to postpone the trial for as long as possible because the news and political rhetoric surrounding these events had been such that it had a high likelihood the accused would not receive a fair trial. The judge agreed. Later in the process, the jury was sequestered, cut off from contact with the community and the news, a step that's taken when cases are highly politicized and there are fears that attempts may be made to persuade or threaten jurors. The eviction that day went ahead, despite Adolfina's death, and by the end of the day, the bulldozers had destroyed everything. It concluded a legal struggle that had unfolded in courts in Rio Grande and Carolina over the course of more than a decade. Adolfina's family's fight to stay in their home is recorded in detail in the court record. The land in question was listed in the official property records as rustica, about 2.5 acres in size and bordered on the north by the maritime zone of the Atlantic Ocean. Here is the original suit, filed by Beremundo Quiñones Mojica in 1970 against 2 defendants whose names he doesn't know. The suit was in fact the second of its kind. The first he filed after purchasing the land in 1965 against the father of these still nameless defendants. Their father had been the caretaker of the land employed by the previous owner. Court filings indicate that the family had been living on this land since the 1940s, when the father of Adolfina and her siblings had become the steward of the property. It's clear that Quiñones was committed, more than committed, perhaps even obsessed, or some combination of obsession and vindictiveness, but I'm speculating, to getting the family off the land. They insist on staying. They hide from process servers. They do whatever they can to avoid the oncoming prow of the huge ship of state that is moving toward them at a gathering rate of speed. The court documents make clear that Adolfina and her family feel they have every legal right to be on this land. They insist repeatedly that they did everything the way they were supposed to. As they speak through their attorney, we hear them say they had been given explicit assurances by the previous landowner that they could build their home in this exact place. Adolfina's father told her that he couldn't give her permission to live on the farm when she married, for example, so they asked the landowner, who said that she and her husband could build on adjoining land that he told them was in the Zona Maritima along the beach, which is land held by the federal government. And they did as he instructed. We have a right to be here, they insist. We were told to build here, and we did build here, and you cannot make us leave. The law, from what I can tell reading the files, was executed correctly by the courts as far as that goes. In order to gain title to land via the process known in the Puerto Rican Civil Code as usucapión, and there's a similar concept in Anglo-Saxon common law, one must occupy it in a way that is pública, pacífica y ininterrumpida. And in English, this is rendered somewhat more forcefully as notorious, hostile, and continuous. That is, you need to occupy the space in such a way that others know about it, not secretively. You need to stay there for a prescribed period, and you need to do so not with the permission of the landowner. And it doesn't matter whether you know that you're not the landowner or you think that you are, it still counts. To this process, there's other details about that are just boring law stuff. According to the Registro de la Propiedad, the land in question was not actually in the federally owned maritime zone. And even if it had been, the property owner would have had the right to the easement that connected the land that he owned with the public space next to the ocean. Ironically, it seems that the underlying problem for Adolfina and her family was the fact that they occupied the land with the permission of the previous owner. This meant that they could stay there legally only so long as they had the owner's permission. And when they challenged Beremundo Quiñones in court, the court declares that no matter what was said, what was promised, the family had no precisely legal right to inhabit this space. But the family, in essence, refuses to accept that the law is just. From 1965 until 1980, they fought it. They simply refused to abide by it. They went to court, although they were, as the court documents indicate, pobre, and did not often leave their community. Each time the court order cautions them to stop building, to stop fortifying their structures, indicates that they have no rights, they continue. Again and again, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff, the landowner. At a certain point, the family's original lawyer renounces her representation of Adolfina and Augustin, her husband, because of how they addressed her in her office, quote. A fight of some kind, obviously. It's impossible to know what happened. Finally, after nearly 10 years of litigation, Adolfina and her family definitively lose their case. Their second lawyer, who had repeatedly gotten Adolfina's name wrong in the court documents, calling her Agustina or Alfonsina, was sick in the hospital, and he missed the deadline for filing an appeal by 3 months. When he asked the judge for more time, those 3 months later, his request is denied. Agustin and Adolfina also petitioned the judge independently for more time. The attorney for the landowner argues that they're trying to manipulate the system. The sentence has been decided, he tells the judge, and there's clearly no further possibility of appeal. The plaintiff, successful, postpones the moment of forcibly regaining possession. Quiñones is seeing to some business in Santo Domingo. Postponed until February 6, 1980. The court document reads, and so it was that on that date, armed police and marshals converged on the plot of land within sound of the sea. After reading the record of the civil case, I understood Marta Villanueva's statement that they went there to kill. The landowner had met his match. The family wasn't going anywhere. Through his lawyer, quote, in his desire, I translated all this stuff, by the way, in his desire to be first and foremost a human being, Beremundo Quiñones had offered them $1,000 if they would voluntarily dismantle what they had, quote, constructed on his property so that they could, quote, easily set up their lives elsewhere. Even as they valued their property, according to these documents, as far more than that, $10,000 to $12,000 was the value that they placed on it. They refused his offer. They have nowhere else to go, the court record states. Adolfina's oldest son, Agustin, was 13 years old when he saw his mother killed. The law structures and determines the most intimate moments. Pucci, I'm going to have to get you to come up here and read this for me because I'm just like, it's so affecting. That's okay, you know? It's okay. I mean, if I like break down and be like, Pucci, come on up here. Are you ready? Okay. Thank you. What do you know about what happened this morning at your parents' residence? The prosecutor asks. In response, Augustine states that he was at home one day with his father and mother and 3 younger siblings. The other 2 were at school. He says that he's in 4th grade, so it's possible that he stayed at home to help his parents regularly. His words, which to the best of my knowledge have not been translated or seen outside the court records, are a raw and immediate testament to what it was like to live in the matrix shaped by the geopolitical histories of colonialism, imperialism, chattel slavery, as they were embodied in that moment in the figures of his parents and Berito, which was how they called the landowner. And as they took the form of the law manifest that day in flesh and blood as the armed marshals and police officers who stood with their long guns, backed by bulldozers. This morning I was in my house with my mom and dad and some of my little brothers and sisters. When the sheriff's deputies and police arrived, Augustine responds to the prosecutor's question. When they got there, I was outside, along with my mom and dad. In that moment, the deputies and the police went up to my dad and told him, "You need to leave here and go with us to see a judge." They had come with Perito, who's the owner of the Finca El Palmar, and who says that the house where we are living belongs to him. Then my dad told him that he couldn't leave, and the police told him he had to leave because there was a judge's order, and my dad, told them that he wasn't going to leave. The police told him that they had come in peace, but that if anyone was wanting trouble, they would give it to them. My dad then said that he wasn't going to leave, that they would have to take him out of there dead. Then the police left, like they were going to the beach, behind the sand dunes. Then my dad went with me behind the corrals, where there is a sow, and my mom stayed behind the house, pressed against a fence. My little brothers and sisters stayed inside the house because my mom told them to. My mom came out of where she had been with something in her hands. I don't remember what, but I know it was nothing sharp, and went toward where the police were. As my mom got close to the police, she was saying something that I couldn't hear and that I don't remember now, and the police shot. Then my dad, who was with me, took his revolver out of his pocket, and he was going to turn it over. At that moment, there wasn't anyone near my dad anymore, and I don't remember if he said anything. Then they shot from pretty far away, the same policeman who had shot my mom, and they shot 2 more times. And then another policeman came up and pulled me away from the fence. I got away from the policeman and was going toward where my dad was, when another policeman aimed his rifle at me and said not to go there. And I answered that I wouldn't. And then I went to my grandma's house. They'll have to take me out of here dead. The law stops here with this body. Adolfina running out to confront the armed men, telling her children to stay inside because it wasn't safe. She was trying to hang on to the one thing that gave them a place in the world. I don't know about you guys, but that testimony of the kid is it's heartbreaking. Imagine what he was having to testify about this stuff. And those are the words that he spoke that are in the record. I'm assuming they're accurate because there would have been someone recording it. Perito Beremundo Quiñones would have been a persistent, haunting presence during almost the whole of Augustine's life, bringing court action after court action. Augustine would have been intimately familiar with a high level of unknowing uncertainty. The case files suggest that there was constantly in the distance the drumbeat of insistence that he and his family did not belong, that they had no rights, and his family over and over again had resisted and countered this story, working to create a new way through sheer force of will and through their relationship to the law. Stefano Harney and Fred Moten write, "The preservation of black social life is articulated in and with the violence of innovation. This is not a contradiction if the new thing, always calling for itself, already lives around and below the forts, the police stations, the patrolled highways, and the prison towers. The forceful and tireless resistance that Adolfina Villanueva and her family exerted was a new thing, always calling for itself. They actively claimed a right that had a physical presence, though that presence was actively obscured, even disappeared in the law. The aspirational fiction of the civil code at that time was the prudent and reasonable man, which has been changed in 2020 to the prudent and reasonable person. But at the time, right, it's specifically masculine language. And that prudent and reasonable man was the Puerto Rican iteration of the propertied white Spaniard around which the Spanish civil code was based, who reappeared on this side of the Atlantic, brought by the same people who had brought the other elements of colonial social structures. He was the standard by which all actions and omissions were measured. What would he think? How would he react? The law was written in such a way as to circle around the fulcrum of this mythic male figure, but that is not what happened here. Year in and year out, as reflected in the legal records, this family refused to act in accordance with the hypothetical actions of a white man who was deemed by the culture at large reasonable. That they refused to accept the mythic reasonable white man as a guide to how they should behave alone made their actions extra legal. Augustine sits for a second interview, this time with a special agent from the federal government. After a few questions that seem designed to put him at ease, do you have a TV in your house? What's your favorite program? The agent says, Augustine, have the goodness to tell me if you had seen the policeman who shot your mom and your dad before. Yes. Where had you seen him before? My ma sold crabs to the policeman's ma. The word he uses is my. So I asked my daughter, who's my native speaker, how would you translate my? And she said ma would work. How did the policeman's mom buy crabs from your ma? I took the crabs to the ma of the policeman. About how many times, more or less, have you taken crabs to the policeman's ma? A few times. About how many times had you seen this policeman? I would see him on Sundays when I took the crabs to his ma. Do you know the name of this policeman? No. Do you know the name of the policeman's ma? Toñita. Did you see when this policeman shot at your mom? Yes. Could you see what he shot her with? Yes, with a rifle. How far, more or less, was this policeman when he shot at your mom? He was about from here to where that chair is. A note in the record indicates the witness indicated a chair that is in this office at a distance of about 10 or 12 feet from where he was sitting. How many times did the policeman shoot your mom? He shot more than once. What did your mom do when he shot her? She fell. I can't judge this testimony. The research on the issues with eyewitness identification is well established, and it's impossible to know what happened before or afterward. Augustine's aunt was present when he was interviewed, and they may have talked. There may be more here. The one thing that's clear from the court record is that the person Augustine identified as his mother's killer, the son of Toñita and a neighbor who was known to them, was not the person who was arrested for her murder. The man who was arrested lived in a neighboring town, as the summons indicates. The defense attorney tells the judge in a motion to dismiss that the issue of the shooter's identification was fraught. He argues that the process was tainted by the prosecutor showing Adolfina's husband only photos in a way that was leading, rather than putting the men in a lineup, even though the attorney states his client was willing to take part in such a lineup. What happened is elusive, but I was left with the unlooked-for sense that the jury's finding was understandable. I'd been thinking that there was a miscarriage of justice, when I read the news about it, that the killer had gotten away with it. There was the question of the description of the shooter as well. In the proof offered by the state, the killer, as identified by Agustín Carrasquillo Pinet, had hair that was medio bueno y medio malo, while the defense attorney states that his client, right, the defendant, is a person que tiene el pelo radicalmente malo. Right? So obviously these words, we don't want to use them, but we know what he's talking about. En la moción al amparo de la regla 64P del procedimiento criminal y supresión de evidencia in November 1980, the defense attorney writes, the only proof that linked the accused, and I'm not using his name, even though it's in the records, because I believe that he was innocent, with the death of Adolfina Villanueva was the result of the photo lineup by the witness Agustin Carrasquillo Pinet, who, as we have already noted, described the defendant as a person with hair that was half good and half bad, fairly short in stature and somewhat heavy, a description that's completely contrary to the description that one could easily make of the accused. Moreover, on 2 occasions, he had to retract the identification that he had made via photos of the person who allegedly shot at him. According to the lawyer, the case turns in part on how African the hair of the shooter was. This motion indicates that Adolfina's husband described the shooter as being basically whiter than his client. The documents in the case file suggest that the injustice of property law that emerges in the civil case was compounded in the criminal trial. If we consider the fact that the contemporary governor of Puerto Rico had described the arrest of the defendant as an achievement of his administration, and we take seriously the idea that there may have been a miscarriage of justice in terms of the arrest, then the idea that the police would arrest a, quote, blacker man than the one who was accused by 2 apparently credible witnesses does not seem surprising. Another witness, Adolfina's nephew, provides information suggesting that the police tried to plant evidence, some kerosene, indicating that Adolfina had assaulted the police and the officer who shot her was acting in self-defense. But in fact, there was never any evidence that Adolfina had brought any sort of weapon, had done anything with, all of that seemed to have been fabricated. Likewise, there was never any evidence that whoever shot her was acting in a premeditated way. And it seems that it is in part on this basis that the accused was found not guilty, because of the specific charges and the things you would have to prove. The statute in the criminal code then in effect was vague, as the clerk of the Puerto Rican Supreme Court at that time attested. He was my professor in law school, and I went up to him after, he just was the guy whose name was in the record, and I went up to him after class, and I was like, can I talk to you about the old criminal code? And he was like, of course. From the available materials, it seems as if it would have been challenging to prove that the accused himself had planned the killing, or even that he was the killer. Looking at documents offered by both the defense and the prosecution, it's unclear that the accused was much more than a scapegoat. Though he was there, certainly, and given the long-standing history of this property dispute, everyone would have known to expect the family to resist. In the end, no one was ever punished by the courts. But let the record show that Adolfina Villanueva and her family believed that the laws of property did not have to be unjust, that there was an escape from its unreason, cloaked as it was in the guise of fairness. At the edge of empire, I sit in class. The professor is Ruben Berrios Martinez, who led the struggle to force the U.S. Navy to relinquish its bombing ranges on the islands of Vieques and Culebra, who has spoken to the U.S. Congress, to the United Nations. We talk about history. We talk about power and free will. An empire of liberty is an impossible thing, though, like so many New World paradoxes, it has endured thanks to the willful blindness of U.S. leaders and the rhetorical justifications of lawmakers and the courts. But perhaps, under the weight of hurricanes, under the weight of centuries of accumulation of contradictions, which is to say itself, under the unyielding pressure of people who have long refused to accept that what is sanctioned in law is not always just, perhaps it is beginning to collapse. It's my hopeful note for the end. Thank you guys for bearing with my emotions. Ever since I had my daughter, I cry so much, but I just feel like it's really appropriate. I mean, this stuff is not academic, right? I mean, I'm reading these files and it's like this, it's so, like all these like old papers, but it's just like the humanness of it just like comes through so strongly, how people like felt, even though it's kind of cloaked in all of this kind of the rituals of the law. it's like, you know, I believe that it's important to honor that. So yeah, again, thank you for listening and any questions that you may have. What do we do now? Right? It's the second part of our performance art.
Thank you for your presentation. We just any questions, comments?
Yeah, comments, questions. Yeah.
I wasn't here for the first time, sorry. We got so lost. I don't know why.
No, I totally don't know how I found this either. Totally.
But you really want me to do this? All right. Hello. Okay, just a quick question, because yes, the case, you know, and some of us have maybe been lucky to participate in the celebration of the life or the marking of the injustice through different, you know, arts and cultural things that happen. However, with the new issues happening with displacement in all our communities, I just thought when I sat here and I heard you from another perspective, also the legal perspective that I was
exactly.
living in court, right?
Yeah.
It just dawned on me, and I haven't gone to all the presentations that Ariadna Godreau's project that works with displacement, how prevalent this case is to, this is like a question that you might not have dealt with, but it's such an important testimony, whatever you want to call it, to what could possibly happen when Kimberly, yesterday, everybody was at activists against displacement at the court. I think it's in Fajardo for the young woman that got jailed for protesting against the selling of the lots in Vieques. So I guess I don't really have a question, but maybe your comment as to what this work that you're doing now maybe can connect, or if you're looking at this current wave of displacement, because we still have the same codes, ¿verdad? Is it the same property laws, or is all the speculation provoking new legislature and hence new ways of dealing with these properties?
I'm not an expert on the property laws and how they're evolving, but like looking at the new code, like the 2020 code, doesn't seem, like, don't quote me on this, like anybody watching online who's a lawyer, like tell me, but I haven't noticed any like significant changes. I mean, the Ley de Tierra is like very forward thinking, right? And that's like still valid, right? It looks like a pretty good law. The problem is just, I think, in like actually enforcing certain provisions of it. That's my sense. That's a sense that's not like informed by study. But as you say, these problems are persisting, and in my kind of thesis, like the problems are persisting because the underlying factors that created them have not changed. And so even say we make a new law, you know, that it has to be enforced, right? I mean, there's a lot of laws on the books. So I think that it sounds like there's hopeful stuff going. I mean, you know, people are still resisting. That is so important. But the struggle is going to be obviously a really long one for that reason, because the fundamental conditions are essentially unchanging. And so that might be, you know, something that it would be really interesting. I mean, thank you for bringing that up, because I would like to write some more about these things. I just feel like they're so fundamental, right? Home is something fundamental, you know. So yeah, maybe we can talk more about that. Did you want to ask something? You can tell I'm always like, do you have something to say? Like in my classes, anybody kind of like moves a little bit and I'm like, well, thank you. I appreciate it. I don't know if anybody else has comments. Yeah, Don.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation, and I appreciate the focus on the law. I'm interested in her as a symbol also. And I think you said at one point that the struggle around this land had been going on for about a decade.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, I think two main things. One is, was she already sort of a symbol based on, you know, what you've read and thought about? You know, had she been featured in the media or anything along those lines? And then I suppose there was a narrative around this too, right? Maybe competing narratives. And since you focused on the law, I'm wondering how the case, which I think you said came much later, how the outcome of the case may have affected, you know, the dominant narratives about this, right? And memory. You're interested in memory.
Yeah.
So does public memory kind of like run up, you know, or your understanding of memory kind of run up against the case, or was it impacted by the case and it aligned with it, or any comments along these lines?
Well, I found out about the case when I was in law school because a classmate of mine, Luz Clemente, she was from the community, and we were doing a project together. And she talked about that because we were talking about issues of race, and I was like, oh, you know, because I'm like some like gringa, like I don't know anything, so I'm like, wow, can you tell me more about what happened? And then the way that she narrated the tragedy, I just wanted to know more. And so I'm maybe a little bit unlikely as a person to be delving into this material and to be speaking authoritatively on the larger context, right? And Pucci, you're probably more like capacitada to like answer, you know, how had she become a symbol?
Certainly within the community of resistance through the arts and culture, and we should share these pictures with you or talk to Rosa Luisa. When the Bread and Puppet from Vermont came to Puerto Rico, or maybe Lowell Feet has this material. The actual puppet, huge, humongous, Adolfina, El Cabezudo de Adolfina, Agua Sol y Sereno also made one. So up to, I'm not sure what happened with Maria and the pandemic. In terms of this festival that I'm almost sure happens every year in Piñones. And you know, now the community is reactivated through a project called El Ancón, which maybe, I don't know if you visited, but that would be a good place to address, I think, like the memory project, as you say, which is really what is fascinating to me is you're linking, again, of the law to the property issues that, you know, Loíza and Piñones are struggling every day because it's so attractive, right?
Mm-hmm.
In
Yes,
the speculation
exactly.
sense
Yeah.
because of the ocean. And time again, I think, you know, the ghost, the secret resistance of Adolfina, you know, always something happens that it doesn't get developed, right? Which is a really good thing. So I think I'm not that knowledgeable only because of Bread and Puppet and Lowell, and maybe having gone once, that there used to be always like a call for everybody to come, and there's a celebration there. But I'd have to check what's happening today. But I think in terms of media, from my memory, maybe Jorge remembers, I remember the newspaper articles maybe when the case was being done, but beyond that, only because our own connection to arts and culture. No sé tú.
Question for you, Pucci, also. So, I mean, because I would be interested to know as well, Don, about this property dispute started in 1965. So there was a long series of like court maneuverings, right, that went on. And my impression was not that they attracted attention up until the moment like of her death or right around then. That wasn't what I was understanding, but I could be missing something, Pucci, that maybe you would be able to shed light on.
What I'm talking about happens after me.
Yeah, like
Lessons that have a consciousness.
she is
80s,
murdered and then
90s,
becomes, yeah.
and maybe through the 2000s, and definitely in song. I would have to check, but she's remembered in songs and, you know, as a cultural figure. Sí, pero like media, we'd have to, maybe Jorge remembers en la época.
came most of the news. That would be, I mean, I out at that time in Ponce, but the news was Villa Sin Miedo. Sort of it covered sort of most of the 80s. I don't know the different dates for the events, but I would say that Villa Sin Miedo was overwhelming in terms of media attention. And then places as, I mean, in terms of cultural memory, what I'm trying to remember is whether when I visited the Ancon to just eat and drink in that nice place that Westerners used to have there, whether there was some pictures or anything, but I
think up to now that it's formally constituted into a cultural space, the next ex-wife is running the cultural project. We should go.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's plan to do that. Yeah. And I mean, and I did want to say also, Don, in response to your question about memory, that one of the things that I hope to highlight in this document is that the narrative seemed to have coalesced around a notion, as I think I mentioned before, that there was a miscarriage of justice. And the point is actually, I mean, yes, there was, but in another way, there wasn't, right? And so it was like they were interpreting the law, like the law was interpreted correctly by the courts in my analysis. But then the person, and then the person who was tried was acquitted justly. I don't think he did it, but it's still that I think there's a notion, right, that somebody got away with murder and someone did, but it wasn't him. And I just feel like the man's name should be cleared. And it doesn't help maybe that I don't say his name or whatever. His name is Victor Estrella Serrano. So he didn't. I believe that the court documents show, the evidence shows the man was innocent.
I mean, one of the comments I would say, I mean, I would look forward to see what comes out of this conference, whether in written form or any other way, sort of performative or seminar or communal, whatever. But one of the things that I'm not a specialist on Puerto Rico yet. I deal with other contexts, but I think that there may be parallels in Jamaica. Thinking about the work of Deborah Thomas, sort of to explore whether we do a informal reading seminar or something to explore some of the issues of violence, land, and justice. But then the other thing would be, I mean, you're thinking about, and this is a more personal issue for me, you're thinking about the rituals of law, but I'm thinking about the rituals of history. And the thing is that I was thinking of my own research on a massacre that took place in 1917 in Cuba, that is in the book. And I had to do, we have not talked about this, this is unscripted, I had to go through all the affidavits of the case to actually find the truth, or sort of doing that, being engaged in that search for the truth, and whether it was justified by the law because there was a martial law that sort of justified the killings at that time in 1917 in Cuba. But I guess the point I'm making is all the emotions that went into the archive when I was going through all the affidavits are not in the book, are not in the publication that ultimately comes out. So I guess I'm thinking the rituals of history writing that take out those emotions. And I think I probably have only shared how I felt in the archive with one person in an email about her own experience. But other than that, I wonder, given what you have said and showed, I mean, what are possible ways, alternative ways to speak to that, to the interconnection of history writing and emotions in the process of searching the truth and justice?
I like, I think that, I mean, in our disciplines, I mean, typically, I think especially so with history, English gives you a little more latitude, maybe because we're connected to literature, but that the notion that the I, right, is somehow contaminating. And And I think that bringing that I into it, I mean, I've been really inspired by writing in anthropology and sociology that is like profoundly poetic, not only in its language, but in its perspective. And I think that that's what I a little bit tried to do at the beginning, is to like evoke, right, through language, how it feels. And I don't need, I mean, I used I, but I could have done that without putting myself in it as well. Even like ways, and this would be a little bit more experimental, but writing that creates a kind of almost like a collage like of texts, and then like response, so that there's a way that like coming off the page we can feel. And I mean, you know, there are historians who are just obviously great storytellers, you know, like yourself, right? Like, and use that storytelling faculty as a way to bring the reader into this moment, right? And how, because our feelings are, I think, a testament to what that history meant. So they're in no way irrelevant, even though they're subjective. That would be something really fun to experiment with, form. You know, if we talked more about this, or if we did a seminar together, that we could like try some experiments with that. I would love to do that. Yeah. Exactly. I think.
What are the guardrails or blindfolds that we force on ourselves, or that are forced on ourselves by the disciplines?
It's not that we can't be objective and subjective at the same time.
Any other questions?
You can use this one if you want.
To look back just a few minutes ago, I think you said that a lot of people have the, this idea that it was a miscarriage of justice, right? And then in a way there's not, right? Because the legal processes were respected, right? Just wonder if you could dig a little deeper there. So is the problem actually, like much more profound? In some other cases, we have people create this dichotomy between justice and legality, right? But you weren't doing that just then. So I'm wondering how you create these. Like, what if, do the lawyers want to hold on to justice as this thing that is about policy and interpretation of the law, right?
I think lawyers are lawyers because at some point, in their formation, they believed that things could be better, and that working within the system was the way to make it right. That if we can just look at what is there, right? Look what it says. Let's follow this. We can have a perfect world if we just follow what is written, right? Because there's something deeply ethical that is embedded in not all of the law, not always, but that there's something about that structure that offers all of us what we need. And so I feel like lawyers, and not to overgeneralize, there's a lot, obviously it's really I don't want to use the word cynicism, but that happens. Working within the system is a way to perfect the law. Not being like the vigilante stuff, all of that stuff, no. But what I think is interesting about this case is that they look like vigilantes, but they're not. They're just calling for the law to respond to its own impulses. It's not doing it. So can we please do it properly? We're going to stay within the law. They consistently went back to the court. They returned to the court. But then they said, no, but this, what you guys are telling us is it shouldn't be legal. The law should say something else. I mean, that's how I interpret their filings. And so it's obvious that, the law is, the law and justice and morality, do not always intersect. But they can. I think that's the thing that with legal training, I'm like, it can. I believe in the law. I mean, fundamentally. And I think that they did too. They just looked at it and said, I'm not in here. This is like the hombre prudente y razonable. Like, what about me? I need to be reflected in that code as well, right? And that will bring me justice. I don't know if that really answers your question. Okay. There's just so much stuff, so many themes and threads and all of this that I find so deeply interesting, and I'm really grateful to you guys for engaging with the ideas that I brought forth and sharing your own ideas and knowledge. I hope we can continue this conversation.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you
Part of our
for...
performance here. This is about emotion, right? We're not going to pretend to,
Yeah.
dive all
Yeah.
that.
Thank you very much. I think we have, I guess, a seminar in the making about probably the archives of violence or something. That would be interesting for a forthcoming event of the Institute. Gracias a todos por su presencia y entonces será hasta la próxima. Muy amable.